When I was 13, my family moved to a small town in northern Minnesota. My dad had taken a job at a nearby lumber mill, and the company provided housing for employees. The house was old but charming, nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest that seemed alive with the whispers of rustling leaves and creaking branches. The backyard had a small garden, a weathered swing set, and the real highlight, a treehouse. The treehouse was tucked high in a massive oak tree at the edge of the yard, just where the forest began. It was old, with faded wood and a slanted roof that barely kept the rain out, but to me, it was perfect. The previous owners had left it behind, complete with a rope ladder and a few dusty chairs inside. My dad fixed it up as best he could, and soon, it became my favorite spot to escape and think. I'd always felt safe in the treehouse, high above the world, surrounded by the forest's constant hum. But what I didn't know was that the treehouse held secrets, dark ones. Secrets that would unravel the peace I'd found there and turn my refuge into a nightmare. The first time I noticed something was off, it was barely noticeable. I'd climbed up after dinner one evening, carrying a flashlight and a book, planning to enjoy the quiet as the sun set. The moment I opened the trapdoor, I froze. The air inside was cold, not the usual coolness of nightfall, but an unnatural chill that sent a shiver down my spine. I shrugged it off as nothing. Maybe it was just the breeze. But as I sat there, trying to focus on my book, I noticed something odd. The walls, which had always been bare wood, were now covered in faint markings. Lines, circles, and symbols I didn't recognize scratched lightly into the planks. At first I thought it was graffiti left by the previous owners, but the markings weren't random. They seemed deliberate, purposeful, like they were meant to form a pattern. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, tracing its shape, and felt a strange vibration in the wood. It was so faint I thought I'd imagined it. I closed the trapdoor and tried to focus on my book, but the quiet seemed heavier than usual, like the treehouse was holding its breath. That was the first time I heard the whispers. They were soft at first, blending with the sound of the wind. I thought it was just the trees swaying, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't random. The whispers were rhythmic, like words spoken just out of reach. They didn't come from outside, they came from the walls. I climbed down in a hurry, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next day, I mentioned the markings to my dad, but he dismissed them as old scratches. "Probably nothing," he said, waving me off. But they didn't feel like nothing. The next week, I brought my younger sister, Lily, up to the treehouse. She was 8 and loved the idea of having an adventure with me. We spent the afternoon playing cards and telling stories, and for a while, everything felt normal. But just as we were about to leave, Lily pointed to the wall. "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I followed her gaze and saw something new. One of the carvings, a simple circle, had deepened, the lines darker and more defined. It hadn't looked like that the last time I was up there. "It's just an old scratch," I said quickly, trying to sound calm. But Lily frowned. "It wasn't there before." That night, the whispers came back, louder this time. I could hear them through my bedroom window, faint but persistent. They seemed to call my name. I stayed away from the treehouse for a few days, hoping the unease would fade. But one evening, as I sat in the living room doing homework, I noticed something strange. The rope ladder was swaying, even though there was no wind. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The yard was still, the forest quiet except for the occasional chirp of crickets. But as I shone the light up to the treehouse, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The trapdoor was open, and a figure was standing inside. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but the figure was tall and thin, its outline sharp against the wooden walls. I froze, unable to move, as it tilted its head, as if watching me. The flashlight flickered, and when the beam steadied, the figure was gone. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. "You've been spending too much time up there," my mom said. "Maybe it's time to take a break." I agreed, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Something was in the treehouse, and it wasn't going to leave just because I stayed away. The next day, I decided to confront it. I waited until the afternoon, when the sun was high and the shadows were less intimidating. Armed with my flashlight and a kitchen knife, just in case, I climbed the ladder. The trapdoor creaked as I pushed it open, and the cold air hit me like a wave. The carvings on the walls were darker now, their patterns more intricate. In the center of the room, something new had appeared, a small pile of stones arranged in a circle. At the center of the circle was a single feather, black and glossy. I didn't touch it. I didn't dare. That night, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just in the treehouse anymore, they were in the house. I heard them in the walls, in the attic, even under my bed. My parents couldn't hear them, no matter how hard I tried to make them listen. Only Lily seemed to notice. "They're mad at us," she whispered one night. "We shouldn't have gone up there." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They told me," she said, her eyes wide. "They don't want us in their tree." The final straw came a few nights later. I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my window. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked out into the yard. The figure was back. This time, it was clearer. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. It stood at the base of the treehouse, staring up at it. And then it climbed. It didn't use the ladder. It didn't need to. It scaled the tree with an inhuman speed, its hands and feet gripping the bark like claws. Within seconds, it disappeared into the trapdoor. The whispers stopped. The next morning, I begged my dad to tear the treehouse down. He was reluctant, but after I told him about the figure, he agreed. By the end of the day, the treehouse was gone, reduced to a pile of splintered wood. But the whispers didn't stop. Even now, years later, I still hear them sometimes, soft, rhythmic, like they're calling me back. And I know the tree wasn't just a tree. It was something else, something alive. Something that's still waiting. When I was 11, my family moved to a small rural town in West Virginia. My dad had gotten a new job, and my parents were thrilled about the opportunity to live somewhere quiet, surrounded by nature. Our house sat at the edge of a large, sprawling forest, and the backyard was massive, a kid's dream. But what really captured my attention was the treehouse. It wasn't ours, not really. My parents said the treehouse had been there long before we moved in, built by whoever owned the property decades ago. It was old, weathered, and half hidden by thick branches, like a secret waiting to be discovered. My dad took a quick look and deemed it safe enough, though he warned me to be careful. I promised I would be. At first, it was everything I could have wanted. The treehouse became my escape, my private little world where I could read, draw, and daydream in peace. I spent hours up there, even bringing my little brother Ben sometimes. But over time, the treehouse began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. The first strange thing happened a few weeks after we moved in. I'd climbed up to the treehouse one sunny afternoon, planning to read a book, when I found something hanging from the ceiling. It was a doll. Not the kind of doll you'd find in a toy store, but a crude, homemade thing. It was made of sticks tied together with twine, with a head fashioned from what looked like a burlap sack. Someone had drawn a face on it in black marker, a simple, childlike smile with two round eyes. It swayed gently, spinning slightly as if it had just been placed there. I stared at it, unsure what to think. Maybe it had been left there by the previous owners, though it seemed odd that no one had mentioned it. I tried to brush it off, untied the doll, and threw it into the woods. Then I went back to my book and tried to forget about it. The next morning, the doll was back. It was hanging from the same spot, swaying slightly in the early morning breeze. My stomach tightened. I climbed up to the treehouse and yanked it down, feeling the rough twine dig into my hands. This time, I didn't throw it into the woods. I stuffed it into a garbage bag, tied it shut, and left it at the curb for the trash collectors. I didn't tell my parents. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I thought they wouldn't believe me, or maybe I didn't want to sound scared. That night, I woke up to a strange sound outside my window. It was faint at first, like something tapping against the glass. I rolled over, half asleep, and ignored it. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. Tap. 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 I sat up, my heart racing. My room was on the second floor, and there was nothing outside my window but air and the tops of trees. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain. The doll was hanging outside my window. I screamed, stumbling back from the window. My parents came rushing in, flipping on the lights. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but when my dad opened the curtain, the doll was gone. He told me it was probably just a nightmare, a trick of my imagination. But I knew what I'd seen. The next day, I avoided the treehouse. I told Ben I didn't want him playing there either, though I didn't tell him why. He didn't argue. He was still young enough to listen to me without question. But even from the house, I couldn't stop looking at the treehouse. It felt like it was watching me. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from my window. It was coming from the back door. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was dark and silent, my parents already asleep. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Slowly, I approached the door and looked through the peephole. There was nothing there. But when I opened the door, I froze. The doll was hanging from the porch railing, its head tilted slightly to the side as if it were looking at me. Its smile seemed wider than before, its black eyes darker, emptier. My hand shook as I untied it, and threw it as far as I could into the yard. Then I slammed the door and locked it, my chest heaving. The next morning, it was back in the treehouse. This time, I told my dad. I dragged him out to the treehouse and pointed at the doll, which was hanging from the ceiling just like before. He frowned, took it down, and examined it closely. "It's just some old toy," he said, tossing it to the ground. "Probably from the last family." "Then why does it keep coming back?" I demanded. He didn't have an answer. But he promised to burn it, just to put my mind at ease. That night, the tapping returned. It was louder this time, coming from multiple directions: my window, the walls, even the floorboards. I sat in bed, clutching my blanket, as the sound surrounded me. And then I heard the voice. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. "Come play," it said. "Come play with me." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away. When I finally opened them, the doll was sitting on my desk, its head tilted toward me. The next morning, I refused to go near the treehouse. I told my dad everything: the tapping, the voice, the doll reappearing in my room. He looked concerned but skeptical. "It's just your imagination," he said, but I could tell he wasn't entirely sure. He decided to tear the treehouse down. "If it's scaring you this much, it's not worth keeping," he said. I watched from the kitchen window as he and a neighbor dismantled the treehouse piece by piece. The whole time, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread, as if destroying the treehouse might make things worse instead of better. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The tapping didn't come back. The house was silent, peaceful. But when I went outside the next morning, I found something waiting for me. The doll was hanging from the tree where the treehouse used to be. Its smile was wider than ever, its black eyes staring right at me. We moved out of that house a year later. My parents never talked about the treehouse or the doll again, and I tried to forget. But even now, years later, I can still hear the tapping sometimes, soft, rhythmic, like a warning. And I know the doll is still out there, waiting for me to come back. When I was 10, my family moved to a quiet neighborhood in upstate New York. It was one of those picturesque suburban areas where the houses had big yards and every street ended in dense woods. Our new house was an old, sprawling colonial with creaky floors and too many rooms, but the real prize was the backyard. Among the towering oaks and maples stood a treehouse. It wasn't just any treehouse. This one was built like a miniature cabin, with 4 sturdy walls, a peaked roof, and windows on every side. A wooden ladder led up to a trapdoor in the floor, and a rope swing hung from one of the thick branches. My dad said the previous owners had built it for their kids, and now it was mine. I loved it instantly. It became my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of my 3 younger siblings. I'd bring books, snacks, and sometimes my mom's old radio and spend hours up there, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves. But as much as I loved the treehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong to me. The first time I noticed something strange was late one afternoon, just before dinner. I'd been up in the treehouse, reading a comic book, when I heard the faint sound of someone climbing the ladder. The creak of the wooden rungs was unmistakable. "Hello?" I called out, expecting to see one of my siblings peeking through the trapdoor. No one answered. I leaned over and looked down, but the ladder was empty. There wasn't even a breeze to explain the sound. I laughed it off, convincing myself I'd imagined it, but a nagging unease followed me back to the house. A week later, I found something that made my stomach drop. As I climbed into the treehouse, I noticed a faint, damp footprint on the floorboards. It was small, like a child's, but neither of my siblings had been up there. I always kept the trapdoor latched, and my siblings weren't strong enough to open it without my help. I told my dad about it, but he just shrugged. "Probably an animal," he said. "Maybe a raccoon got up there." I wasn't convinced. Raccoons didn't leave footprints that looked like a barefoot child's. Things escalated after that. Every time I went to the treehouse, I'd find something new. One day, it was a piece of string tied in an intricate knot, dangling from one of the beams. Another day, I found a small wooden carving of a figure with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. I threw it into the woods, but the next day, it was back, sitting in the exact same spot. The worst was the tapping. It started late one night, just as I was falling asleep. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting my window, but when I got up to look, the tapping stopped. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, to be the wind. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to check the treehouse. I hadn't been up there in days, too scared of what I might find. As I climbed the ladder, I noticed something new, scratches on the trapdoor, deep and jagged, as if someone had been clawing at it. Inside, the treehouse was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. On the floor, in the exact center of the room, was a folded piece of paper. My name was written on it in shaky, uneven letters. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside, the message was short but chilling. "Come out and play." I bolted, climbing down the ladder so fast I nearly fell. My dad was in the garage, and I dragged him out to the treehouse, babbling about the note. When we got there, the paper was gone. The scratches on the trapdoor were still there, but my dad said it was probably just normal wear and tear. "You've got an overactive imagination," he said with a chuckle. But I knew what I'd seen. That night, the tapping came back, louder and more insistent. I buried my head under the covers, trying to block it out, but it didn't stop. Then I heard it, a faint voice, muffled but clear enough to understand. "Tommy," it whispered. "Tommy, come out." I froze. My name had never sounded so wrong. I wanted to scream for my parents, but my voice caught in my throat. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually, the voice faded, and the tapping stopped. The next morning, I found marshmallows stuck to my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was a prank by one of my siblings, but the marshmallows were arranged in a smiley face, their sticky residue dripping down the glass. My parents thought it was odd but dismissed it as a neighborhood prank. That afternoon, I climbed back into the treehouse, determined to confront whatever was going on. Inside, I found another note, this one scrawled in red ink. "I see you." I told my dad everything. He finally agreed to take the treehouse down, but it would have to wait until the weekend. Until then, I wasn't allowed to go near it. That night, I woke to the sound of the ladder creaking. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to get up. I peeked out my window, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A figure was climbing the treehouse ladder. It was small, hunched, and moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. I couldn't make out its face, but its limbs were too long, its hands gripping the rungs with a sickening strength. It reached the trapdoor and disappeared inside. The next day, my dad dismantled the treehouse. He didn't believe my story, but he humored me, saying it was time for it to come down anyway. As the pieces of wood came crashing down, I thought I saw something in the branches, a pale face watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I've never been back to that house. My parents moved years ago, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again, faint and distant. And I wonder if whatever was in the treehouse ever really left.